We're tackling David Chalmers' The Character of Consciousness today, and it really tackles some of the biggest questions out there. Really, I think you could call this the fundamental question of, what is consciousness?
Right. And I think one of the things that makes it so interesting is that it really is a foundational text for a lot of the discussion of consciousness.
I think one of the ways to sort of start to unpack that is this idea that he introduces very early on about this distinction between what he calls the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness.
Right.
And maybe we can start there. What does he mean by that?
Well, so I think it's helpful to think about what he means by the easy problems first, because it's sort of counterintuitive, right? The
Yeah.
easy problems are things like explaining how we perceive the world,
Right.
how we learn, how we remember things, how we control our behavior. These are all things that seem very complicated.
Really complex, yeah.
But Chalmers is saying that, in principle, these are problems that can be solved by standard methods in cognitive science.
Right. So we can imagine a future where we have a very clear understanding of the neural mechanisms involved, the computations that the brain is making to achieve these things.
So he's not saying they're easy in the sense that we've already solved them, but he's saying that the type of problem that they are is something that science can address.
If those are all the easy problems, what's the hard problem?
Yeah. So the hard problem, according to Chalmers, is the problem of explaining experience. So the fact that there is something that it's like to be conscious, that there is this subjective aspect to our mental lives.
You know what's so interesting about this to me is that I feel like we all kind of know what he's talking about when he says that. Like, we all experience the world. We know what it's like to see the color red or to feel pain or to hear music. But if you try to explain that to someone who's never experienced it, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, it's kind of ineffable, right? It's this sort of first-person subjective quality that's really hard to put into words. And this is really what Chalmers means by the hard problem. How do we explain how those experiences arise? How do we explain what it is like to have those experiences?
And his point is that even if we had a perfect understanding of all the easy problems, even if we knew exactly how the brain processes information and controls behavior, we still wouldn't have answered that question of, like, why is there something that it's like to be? Why isn't it just all happening in the dark?
Like, we could have a robot that could do everything a human could do, but wouldn't necessarily have any inner experience. The hard problem, though, that's a problem of experience itself, what it feels like to be conscious.
Right.
Nagel, another philosopher, put it really well when he said there's something it is like to be a conscious organism.
Okay.
And it's that what it is like that Chalmers is really grappling with.
So Chalmers is saying even if we understood all the nuts and bolts of the brain, we still wouldn't fully grasp what it's like to experience something.
You could explain how our eyes detect light or how neurons fire when we remember a face.
Uh-huh.
But the quality of that experience, the redness of red, the feeling of pain, that's not explained by those mechanisms alone.
So it's not just about function, it's about the subjective feeling that goes along with it.
And this is where he really starts to challenge traditional materialism.
Okay, so how does he go about looking at consciousness then?
Well, he looks at several different approaches, but what he really pushes for is a science of consciousness that takes seriously our first-person data. He thinks we need to study the relationship between those first-person experiences and third-person data, like brain processes and behavior, but he's very clear that we shouldn't try to reduce consciousness entirely to these third-person things.
So we're looking for connections and patterns.
Yeah.
But not saying consciousness is just neural activity.
He talks about some interesting avenues for research. One is comparing conscious and unconscious processes. Like, you can have conscious visual perception, but there's also unconscious visual processing happening.
Yeah.
Same with memory. There's explicit memory where you're aware of remembering something, and implicit memory where you're not.
Oh, interesting.
So looking at where the function might be the same but the experience is different can tell us a lot. He also talks about searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, what he calls NCCs.
So the specific neural processes that go along with conscious experience.
But he cautions us not to let our philosophical baggage color how we interpret those correlations.
Oh, I see. So just because we find a brain state that consistently happens when someone feels happy doesn't mean we've explained why that brain state causes that feeling.
And this leads us to his arguments against materialism. So that's really the challenge that Chalmers is putting forward. And the rest of the book is in many ways trying to address that challenge.
Okay, so let's get into that then.
Yeah.
How does he start to grapple with this hard problem? What's his approach?
Well, I think the first thing that he does is he looks at what are the existing attempts to address this problem, and he spends a lot of the book actually arguing against those attempts.
Okay.
So specifically, he's arguing against what's known as materialist views of consciousness.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, what is materialism in this context?
So in this context, materialism is the view that everything in the universe, including consciousness, can be explained in terms of physical processes. So it's the idea that there's nothing more than the physical stuff.
Okay, so it's like the brain is a machine and consciousness is just what the machine does.
And it's the idea that if we understand how the machine works, we'll understand consciousness.
Okay.
And Chalmers is arguing that that's not enough.
Okay.
And he actually spends a good chunk of the book, specifically chapters 5 through 7, are devoted to arguing against different types of materialism.
Oh, wow.
So he's really taking it seriously.
Yeah.
And I think, that's one of the things that I think makes the book so compelling is he's not just putting forward his own view, but he's really engaging with the alternative views in a serious way.
He's not just dismissing them. He's like, okay, let's really consider this.
Yeah, and I think that's, a hallmark of good philosophy.
Absolutely.
So he looks at different types of materialism. He looks at what he calls type A materialism, which is the view that we can explain consciousness just by explaining functions and explaining our beliefs about consciousness.
Okay.
So the idea is that if we can explain why we say things like, I'm in pain or I see red, then we've explained consciousness. And Chalmers' argument against that is that, that's not enough. That explaining the functions and explaining the reports doesn't actually explain the experience itself.
So it's like you could have a computer program that could output the statement, I see red, but it doesn't mean the computer program is actually experiencing the color red. Okay, so that's type A. What's the next type of materialism?
So the next type of materialism he looks at is type B materialism.
Okay.
And this is a little bit more subtle. This is the view that, okay, maybe there is a gap in our current understanding between the physical and the phenomenal, between the brain and the experience.
Okay.
But there isn't a fundamental gap in reality. So the idea is that there are these primitive necessary connections between physical properties and phenomenal properties. We just don't understand them yet.
Okay, so it's like, yeah, there's something missing in our knowledge, but eventually we'll get there. We'll figure out how these things are connecting.
Right.
And what does Chalmers say to that?
So Chalmers' response to that is that even if that's true, even if there are these necessary connections, if they're primitive, if they're just brute facts about the universe, then that's still not a very satisfying explanation. And in a way, it's kind of giving up on the materialist project because materialism is supposed to be about explaining everything in terms of physical laws and physical mechanisms. And if you have to just say, well, there's this brute fact that this physical thing gives rise to this experience, that's not really explaining it in the way that materialism sets out to do.
Like saying, well, magic happens here and we don't know why.
Yeah. So he's basically saying that even the most sophisticated versions of materialism ultimately fall short of explaining consciousness.
Okay, so he's basically cleared the ground.
Yeah.
Right? He said, okay, these materialist explanations don't work. So what does he offer in its place?
This is where things get really interesting. He puts forward his own speculative view, which he calls the double aspect theory of information. And it's important to emphasize that he himself acknowledges that this is not a fully fleshed out theory. It's more of a kind of framework for thinking about the problem.
Okay.
But the basic idea is this. That information has two fundamental aspects.
Okay.
It has a physical aspect, and it has a phenomenal aspect. So in other words, information can exist in the physical world, like in the brain or in a computer, but it also has this inherent experiential quality to it.
Wow. So it's like saying that the information itself has an inner life.
And that experience arises when this information is embodied in physical processing. So when the information is processed in a certain way by a brain, for example, then that's when experience arises.
Okay. And this might be like too simplistic of a way to put it, but it's almost like saying the hardware is the physical aspect of the information and the software is the phenomenal aspect of the information.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a very intriguing idea.
It is.
But I think it's also important to emphasize that, as Chalmers himself says, this is really more of an idea that needs to be fleshed out. There are a lot of questions that it raises.
Of course, like what kind of information has this double aspect?
Yeah.
How exactly does experience arise from the processing of information?
Yeah.
and so on. Yeah.
And he doesn't claim to have all the answers to those questions.
But he does offer some kind of supporting considerations for this view.
He does, yeah. He points to a number of things.
Yeah.
So, for example, he points to the fact that there seems to be a very close correlation between changes in our conscious experience and changes in the information processing that's happening in our brain. So when you have a new experience, when you learn something new, when you see something new, there are corresponding changes in your brain. And those changes are significant because they represent changes in the information that's being processed.
Right. So it's like there's this very tight coupling between the information and the experience.
And that suggests that there's some kind of deep connection there.
Yeah.
He also points to the fact that information is a very good candidate for explaining this principle of organizational invariance.
Okay. And what is that principle again?
So the principle of organizational invariance is the idea that if you have two systems that have the same abstract organizational structure, then they will have the same kind of conscious experience.
Okay, so it's not about the specific material that the system is made of. It's about the way the system is organized. Okay.
So for example, if we could build a computer that was organized in the same way as a human brain,
Yeah.
then according to the principle of organizational invariance, that computer would have the same kind of conscious experience as a human being.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it suggests that information is a very good candidate for being the thing that underpins consciousness. Because information is all about organization. It's about the relationships between different parts of a system, and it doesn't matter what those parts are made of. So that's another reason that he thinks information is a good candidate for explaining consciousness. And he also points to a couple of other things. He talks about how information can help to explain the principle of structural coherence.
Okay. And just to remind us, what is structural coherence?
So structural coherence is the idea that our conscious experience is not just a random collection of sensations, but it's structured in a certain way.
Right.
So, for example, our visual experience is spatially organized. Our auditory experience is temporally organized. And Chalmers thinks that information can help to explain that because information itself can be structured in different ways. So he thinks that the structure of our conscious experience might reflect the structure of the information that's being processed.
Okay, so there's this idea that there's like a mirroring between the structure of information and the structure of experience.
And then finally, he also talks about how information can help to explain the relationship between our experience itself and our judgments about our experience.
Okay.
So, for example, when you see a red object, you have the experience of seeing red. You also form the judgment that you're seeing red. Chalmers thinks that information can help to explain both of those things because the experience of seeing red is a result of certain information being processed in your brain. And the judgment that you're seeing red is also a result of certain information being processed in your brain.
Okay, so it's like information is the common currency here. It's
Yeah.
what underlies both the experience and our ability to talk about and think about the experience.
Exactly. So those are some of the reasons that Chalmers thinks that information is a good candidate for explaining consciousness. But like I said, it's still a very speculative view.
Right.
And I think it's important to keep that in mind. But it's a very intriguing view.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a view that, is going to continue to be debated and discussed for many years to come. So in addition to this double aspect theory of information, Chalmers also introduces this tool for analysis that he calls the two-dimensional framework.
Yes. He explains that more in an appendix, but it really is a key tool that he uses throughout the book.
And just for our listeners who are hearing about this for the first time, what is the two-dimensional framework? What's the basic idea there?
So I think maybe the easiest way to think about it is that it's a way of thinking about the meaning of terms and concepts.
Okay.
And it involves considering two different dimensions of meaning. So one dimension is what Chalmers calls the primary intention, and that's basically our current understanding of a concept. It's how we think about it based on what we know right now.
Okay.
And the other dimension is what he calls the secondary intention, and that's the concept's true meaning, its ultimate reference in the world, regardless of what we happen to know right now.
Okay, so the primary intention is kind of like our subjective understanding, and the secondary intention is kind of like the objective reality of what the concept refers to.
And Chalmers argues that this distinction is really important for understanding consciousness because it allows us to separate what we can conceive of from what's actually possible.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how he applies this? Like, how does it actually play out in the discussion of consciousness.
Sure. So one of the classic arguments against materialism is the zombie argument. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so the zombie argument is the idea that we can conceive of a being that's physically identical to us, but that lacks conscious experience. So imagine a zombie that looks and acts just like you, but there's nothing going on inside.
Right, right. No inner experience.
Right. And the argument is that if we can conceive of this zombie, then consciousness can't be just a physical thing, because the zombie is physically identical to us.
But it's missing something crucial.
And so Chalmers uses the two-dimensional framework to analyze this argument. And he says, okay, it might be true that we can conceive of a zombie. That doesn't mean that a zombie is metaphysically possible.
Okay, so there's a difference between what we can imagine and what can actually exist.
And the reason for that is that our concept of consciousness, our primary intention of consciousness, might be incomplete.
Okay.
So we might be thinking about consciousness in a way that's too limited. And that's preventing us from seeing that consciousness is actually just a physical thing.
Okay, so it's like our current understanding of consciousness might be like a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object.
Right, and that's why we can imagine these things that seem impossible.
Because a representation is incomplete.
Right, and so Chalmers thinks that the two-dimensional framework is a really useful tool for thinking about these kinds of arguments.
Yeah, it seems like it helps to really clarify what we're talking about when we talk about conceivability and possibility.
And it helps to avoid conflating what we can imagine with what's actually possible.
Okay, so we've talked about the double aspect theory of information. We've talked about the two-dimensional framework. What else? What are some of the other key ideas that Chalmers presents in the book?
Yeah, so another really important idea that he discusses is the nature of phenomenal concepts. And these are the concepts that we use to think about our own conscious experiences.
Okay, so like the concept of redness or the concept of pain.
And Chalmers argues that phenomenal concepts are unique in a very important way.
Okay.
He says that they involve a kind of direct reference to the experience itself.
Okay, what does that mean?
So it means that when you think about the concept of redness, for example, you're not just thinking about some abstract description of redness. You're actually, in some sense, directly accessing the experience of redness itself.
Wow, so it's like the concept is somehow infused with the experience itself.
Right, and that's a very different kind of concept from most of the concepts that we use. Most of our concepts are more indirect. They refer to things in the world by describing their properties or their functions.
Okay.
But phenomenal concepts are different. They're more like a direct window into the experience itself.
Okay. And why is that important? Why is that distinction important?
Well, Chalmers thinks that it's important because it helps to explain why the hard problem is so hard.
Okay.
Because if phenomenal concepts are these special kinds of concepts that directly refer to experience, then it's going to be very difficult to explain them in purely physical terms.
Right, because physical explanations are all about describing properties and functions.
And Chalmers is saying that that's not going to be enough to explain phenomenal concepts, because phenomenal concepts are about the experience itself, not about the properties or the functions that give rise to the experience. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the hard problem. We've talked about Chalmers' arguments against materialism. We've talked about the double aspect theory of information. We've talked about the two-dimensional framework, and we've talked about phenomenal concepts. So just to kind of bring it all together, what would you say is the central takeaway from Chalmers' book?
I think the central takeaway is that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, and it's not something that can be reduced to or explained away by purely physical processes.
Right. It's not just a byproduct of the brain. It's something more than that.
Exactly. And Chalmers thinks that we need new ways of thinking about the world, new ways of doing science
Yeah.
in order to fully understand consciousness.
Right. We need to expand our framework, and that might be a very long process. Yeah.
But I think it's a really exciting challenge.
It is. And I think Chalmers is really giving us a lot to think about here. He's giving us some really important tools for understanding this very fundamental question of what it means to be conscious.
So for our listeners who are now contemplating all of this, and I'm sure their minds are buzzing,
Yeah.
what's something that maybe they can take away from this conversation, something that they can kind of chew on, as they go about their day?
I think one thing to think about is, if consciousness is this fundamental feature of reality, how does that change the way we think about ourselves and the world around us? If it's not just us humans who are conscious, but maybe other animals, maybe even other kinds of systems, how does that change our ethical obligations? How does that change your understanding of what it means to be a person?
And if information plays this central role in consciousness,
Right?
how does that change the way we think about technology? How does that change the way we think about the future?
Right? Could we create conscious machines? Should we?
Right. Huge, huge questions.
Yeah.
So much to think about. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the character of consciousness. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.